All right, we're here with Zachary Slayback today, who is the Business Development Director for Praxis, was also on the founding team of Praxis, which is an experiential learning program for entrepreneurs. Here to be interviewed by Isaiah McPeak, who is our head coach and CEO of Ethos Debate, to learn a little bit about what Zachary thinks about how high school debate and debate as a whole comes to real-life careers.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Zach. I really appreciate it. I know you and Abby go way back, but learning about you is kind of new to me. And I'm probably to our audience. I'm really excited as an entrepreneur and a founding team member of a tech startup myself to hear about what you're doing and what you're up to. Would you start by just telling our audience a little bit about what is Praxis and what are you up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give you a little bit of an overview of what Praxis is, as Abby said, it's an experiential learning experience, but to go into greater detail on what that actually means for young people is we take young people 18, 25, and we place them at startups. It's essentially an apprenticeship for the 21st century. So if you're an ambitious, entrepreneurial young person who's interested in creative problem solving, right? You may not even necessarily want to own equity in a privately held company someday. You're interested in creative problem solving. We will place you at a growing startup, at a growing business. And you will get to apprentice real people, real founders of that company, adding real high quality experience and value to that company. So it's not, it's not an internship experience. We don't take people and we put them to grab coffee and make copies. That's none of what we do. Our participants take real projects, add real value to the company, and are there for 10 months. So while they're doing that, they're going through an education experience that we facilitate that covers everything from professional and personal development to philosophy, history, economics. We're working on some quantitative skills now, all these things. It's the best that one-on-one education, truly learner-driven education, and awesome work experience can guarantee people.
Is this aimed at the post-high school audience age group, or is there like a target time you start, or can it be any time?
We primarily market to 18 to 25, and I think I think if you can do it right out of high school, that's an awesome opportunity to take. That's an awesome time to do it. A lot of people don't just jump headfirst into college, right? And they end up learning, a lot of really smart, really driven young people end up learning that maybe wasn't the best move for them, right? You get a lot of people in the United States today who will say, too many young people go right to college. But they're usually talking about, too many young people that are going to show up like hungover to their classes on a Monday morning, right? I'm talking about too many high caliber young people, too many young people who, they do speech and debate in high school and they do well at it. There are too many young people who really do see themselves as high caliber, entrepreneurial, hardworking. Mm-hmm. And about a third of all of our participants do it after college. The other 2/3, they do it, right after high school or maybe 2 years after high school. Yeah.
Got it. And so do you have to kind of be an entrepreneurial bent person, or do you maybe not even know that when you get involved with a program like yours?
So there's a difference between being an entrepreneur and being entrepreneurial, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that if you want to succeed as a young person going into the economy today, this is, I actually just got back from a university here in Pittsburgh speaking about this. You need to be entrepreneurial. Even if you don't want to start a company, even if you don't want to run your own company someday, you need to be entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurial means you're a creative problem solver. You can combine creative labor with non-creative labor. Because non-creative labor, that can be outsourced, that can be automated, that can be displaced. And we're really at a time when, because of all these other intersecting forces, that's going to happen. So if you view yourself as an entrepreneurial, as a creative problem solver, an entrepreneurial young person, Praxis can be a great opportunity for you. If you are someone who, you have started a company in high school or you want to start a company soon, Praxis is also a great option for you. It's not everything for everybody, right? And I don't want to try to convince somebody that it's everything for everybody. But if you view yourself as someone who likes to work, likes to create value, and likes to get out there in the marketplace, Praxis is a great option for you.
Yeah, so it's interesting some of the themes you've hit on, which as someone who's hired maybe 60 people in the past 3 or 4 years, and I don't know, I've interviewed maybe 450 over that time, the phrase problem solver is that's my phrase, I feel like. So, and it comes from I didn't know in high school as a debater that I even had entrepreneurial bent or anything. My dad was a government worker, he's a career military, and those weren't terms that we use necessarily, were business terms. And so I have kind of a shared passion with you about the idea that debaters are professional problem solvers.
Yeah.
Right. And the 21st century demands that kind of thinking. How do you think the debate skills really transfer to this 21st century job market? And how do you think somebody can recognize that that's even the case in a world where job descriptions in college are like, that's what it's about?
Yeah, I mean, before we even jump into how the 21st century job market is totally different than the old market, right? And that's something I can really, really hit on if we'd like to. But before we even hit on that, we need to think about what are the traits that make anybody successful, right? At whatever they do. And I have noticed through the hundreds of business partners I've talked to, the hundreds of young people I've interviewed for the program, and our alumni, our successful alumni from the program, and not to mention, other people I've come across while doing this the last couple of years, is there are really two characteristics that define as somebody who can be successful. And they're not something that can just be learned in a couple hours, right?
Right.
They're traits, right? Since everybody here is a debater, it's a very Aristotelian idea, right? They're habits you have to be able to, And that's confidence and self-worth. Those are the two most important things. All right, I'm sorry. Confidence as self-worth or confidence in work ethic. So being a successful debater takes both of those. Very, 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 very much so, and to a very high level, right? A very successful debater is very confident. They have high self-esteem, and not like the schmaltzy sense of the word, like, oh, everyone needs to have high self-esteem. You can't ever lose. But in the sense of actually having self-worth, in the sense of having integrity, in the sense of being able to do your work, stand up there and defend it. That is hard. It's hard for most people to do, and any successful person has that. They also have a great sense of work ethic. You can tell at a certain level in debate, you can tell the kid who just doesn't have the work ethic, the kid who just doesn't do the research, the kid who's just getting up there and winging it. And I mean, we've all been there at one point or another, but to consistently do debates successfully, you need to have work ethic and you need to have confidence. Debaters are some of my favorite people for that reason to throw into the entrepreneurial space. I did debate in high school myself. I jumped around between the league I was in, had public forum debate and Lincoln Douglas debate. I resuscitated the Lincoln Douglas debate in my region. And what I learned from that has been so valuable going forward. In the workplace as the 21st century, now that separate question, there's a couple of things that we can point to here. One, debate is nice because it's not one of these things that is usually boiled down into a lot of hand-holding, right? You can coach people on it. They can go to camps, and they should for self-betterment. But you have to do it at the end of the day. You have
to stand there for an hour, and somebody's going to debate you, and nobody can say, wait, just do this thing, and it'll be okay.
And someone's going to tear you apart limb from limb if you don't do your work. I remember the first nationals I went to getting torn apart limb from limb. And the kid who did it, I'm still friends with him today. I still talk to him occasionally. But that's really important because that doesn't exist in the world. And maybe it did in the 70s and 80s at like these big, white collar corporations, where you have a manager and your manager has a manager and your manager has a manager who has a manager. You really did have, micromanaging going on. That doesn't happen anymore. A lot of people, they work from home. You may not think of yourself as an entrepreneur, but if you ever want to work from home, you have to have highly entrepreneurial traits because no one's going to walk by and tell you, you got to be doing this, this, and this right now. A lot of solopreneurs are the same way, right? One of the biggest, most dangerous things we do, by we, I mean, culturally, do to young people today is that a lot of the people offering career advice to them haven't had to find jobs for 15, 20 years, right? So I like speech and debate because, one, most of the people who are involved in it at any level are relatively young. I think that's helpful. They're, people like yourself who, are just a couple years into the marketplace compared to someone who's been there for like 40 years, right? I think that's a good thing. And it's entirely experientially driven. And human beings learn best through experience. It's just how that we've developed. So,
Yeah. So sitting there doing clerical work with someone telling you what to do is limiting.
Right. It's
Right.
limiting. It's limiting, and those jobs just don't exist anymore.
Right. Well, work's not done that way because information's free now.
Right.
It's everywhere.
I mean, I was mentioning earlier at the talk I was giving earlier today that in the 80s, in the 60s, more the 60s and 70s, you had people whose job it was at companies to collate papers. Now, I have a printer right here. I've got a printer right here that can do that collating, right? I don't have to print everything off and send it off to someone to collate it at like FedEx.
Mm-hmm.
Those simple jobs just aren't going to exist anymore. And because of Moore's Law and because of the decreasing cost of technology, more and more jobs that we view as like safe jobs, like doctors and lawyers and accountants, are going to be automated or outsourced.
Right. Yeah. So let's go back to this transference of skill then, and talk about what should a debater not transfer from debater land into the real world.
What should a debater not transfer from debater land? Wow, that's a good question, and I'll tell you, I've judged a number of different debate leagues now. The league I did when I was in high school, I went to a public high school. The league I did was the National Catholic Forensics League, which was, pretty good all in all for the public ones that I'd been to. I judged a couple NFL tournaments, NCFCA, STOA now as well. And I see it less in NCFCA and STOA, but you'll find some debaters who are not very good public speakers, right?
Yeah. They're listing arguments. They have very long lists of arguments.
Very long, convoluted lists of arguments. They speak very, very quickly. When I was in high school, I was always convinced there was a conspiracy among the NFL kids to speak as quickly as possible to confuse their opponents. That's not a good skill set, right? They're gaming the system, but the system is not one that's applicable to the rest of the world.
Right.
So, understand that the real world is one where communication reigns supreme, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a lot of us in debate, we're very analytically oriented people. And that's good, having good analytic skills and keeping them up to date, doing essentially like going to the gym for your brain, right? Those are good things to do. However, you do find a lot of people who fall so much into this analytic mindset, they're not as good at telling stories. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that you can learn, the debaters can learn from speech kids, is the importance of storytelling. So a lot of my job is sales, going to a company, telling them the story of Praxis and convincing them to buy into our story. And that doesn't come naturally to me as a highly analytic person, right? Fundraising, right? If you've ever done fundraising for a startup, that's storytelling. You would think it's like, here's the data, here's our argument, here's, logical flow, a proof. Right. It's actually storytelling, especially for an early stage startup, because investors don't have a lot to go off of data.
Yeah, and you think about it even further, like when you, just percentage-wise in sales and marketing, how much of the words in communication that go to a prospect are first on the internet? Like you don't have a captive audience like you do in a debate round for 40 minutes. You can't leave. Like they have to make a snap judgment, right? And that's probably the majority of your work is written, right?
You have to pull people in. I just got off the phone before this call with a marketing automation software service out of Phoenix, right? That specializes in this. You tell the story, they help you pull the people in, actually collect that data. And that's really important. I realize that most people don't thrive on confrontation like debaters do. But if you can understand that, and if you can combine the analytic abilities that you develop with a strong sense of storytelling, that is so powerful. Mm-hmm. I love finding people who are great at verbal communication and written communication and are analytically oriented.
Well, I think that's full circle what you said about being both creative and knowledgeable, right? In the 21st century economy is you have to be able to deliver.
Right.
But you have to package it too.
Right. I've been working off, in a couple of my talks, I've been using what I call the pyramid of work, right? At the very, very top of the pyramid, I have creative labor. At the very, very bottom, I have unskilled physical labor. And I'm not trying to make a moral judgment about any of these, right? I'm not saying like unskilled physical labor is bad. I'm saying that unskilled physical labor is easy to automate. It's easy to get machines to do. It's easy to outsource, right? stamping things onto a license plate, right? That can be done very easily.
Mm-hmm.
Creative labor sits at the top, not necessarily because it's better, but because it's really hard for machines to do. Computers can't think creatively. That's the one thing they're bad at. If you can think creatively and you can combine that with analytic skills, so like the creative engineer type is someone who can easily build a company and tell a story. A lot of companies have to have multiple founders because the engineers are engineers and they're the engineer archetype, right? And they need someone who can tell a story or they need someone who can understand business. So yeah, going full circle and really combining both of those is an extremely valuable skill. And if you do want to start a company someday, if you cannot pull in multiple people, you can retain more ownership of the company. That's important for decision rights. That's important for net worth. It's important.
And you can last longer in your startup phase, right? Which is, It's on you. You don't have to think of, I have to feed 7 other people in this time frame that we're putting this whole thing together.
Yeah, makes it much easier to fundraise.
So what advice would you give? Let's say a 13 or 14-year-old person is starting out into speech and debate, and that means that for the first time they're researching these policy topics, right? Yeah. And they say things to me all the time each summer like, well, I'm never going to really talk about agriculture and fisheries, in my professional career. So I'm not going to really get into the research or something like that. What would you say to that person?
There are certain things that you can pick up when you're doing policy research or really any kind of research that are highly transferable skill sets. So I think learning an economic way of thinking is an extremely valuable skill that is applicable no matter the job you go into. That's, understanding how to think on the margin. That's understanding opportunity costs. It's understanding supply and demand. Those kinds of things, that is transferable anywhere. And those are things that come through in policy research, right? Understanding why, if we print more money, you're going to have a higher level of inflation and you're going to increase the possibility of like a bubble, right? Understanding basic monetary theory is actually really, really important. Business cycle theory, things like that. I also think, I judged a debate recently where it was a policy round, and it was it was an NCFCA final round here in Pittsburgh, semifinal round. I apologize. And the winning team was I think like a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old against two 18-year-olds, and they won. They were good. Like both teams were very good, but they won largely simply because they did more research. And attention to detail is really, really important, right? You never know when overlooking a tiny detail can really turn a whole case. So in their case, they were debating about reforming the federal courts in the U.S. And the opposite team had argued that the opposite team had essentially argued for the status quo, and they didn't realize it. They didn't realize that the executive branch can just choose not to enforce the Supreme Court's decisions. And it's really just going on a presumption of the rule of law that the executive branch decides to do that. And they pointed that out. And they blew a huge hole in the other team's argument that had the other team just done a little bit more research about, judicial theory, they would have won. They probably would have won. But they would have had to have also developed an entirely different case. So I think I think there are a lot of important takeaways, right? So like, I don't know. I majored in philosophy in the 2 years I was in college, and I don't use the substance of what I learned in philosophy, right? But I use a philosophical way of thinking, understanding, breaking down, as an LDer at heart, this really speaks to the LD debaters, understanding the importance of flows, understanding the importance of logic, understanding conceptual analysis more than anything else. The number of times I have to just sit down after talking to someone and break down, the values that this person is operating in the world with, I couldn't name them for you. There's so many of them, right? And understanding how those values relate to other beliefs that person has about the world. That's really important for me about sales too, because at the end of the day, people vote and people buy based on their values. I actually don't think people buy and vote based on their explicit beliefs, but they vote and buy based on their implicitly held values. And appealing to those, if you're doing marketing, sales, building a product, working for a nonprofit, running an electoral campaign, that's really important to understand. I was facilitating a colloquium this past weekend in Detroit, where the last the last session of the colloquium was all about how to change the world. Everybody got so caught up in discussing how to change people's explicit beliefs. And as, naturally analytically oriented people and as debaters, it's almost heresy to say people's beliefs really don't matter all that much. But I really don't think they do. And understanding the values behind people's beliefs that they state is more important, and how you appeal to those values. Certain presidential candidates in the United States today, for example, I can think of two on different parties. I will leave them unnamed. I think that most people who like them actually don't agree with a lot of their policy positions, but they hold similar core values. The policy positions, are derivations of those values a couple steps down.
Right. And so understanding the deepest reasons of why people do things goes back to what you said. Like, you can't tell a story that grips someone unless you can parse apart, the reasons that you do things, which is, interestingly, a very deep understanding of self, which is probably where your self-esteem or self-worth kind of comes from, right?
Absolutely.
First.
I'm a big fan, like I said, I don't like the whole schmaltzy self-esteem movement kind of stuff. I'm a big fan of Nathaniel Branden's work on this matter.
I'm not familiar with it.
He just passed away a couple years ago, but he's phenomenal. He was a psychologist who looked all into the psychology of self-esteem. And what self-esteem is in his book is, yes, knowing your values and making sure that the habits you develop and the actions you take in the world match with those values. It's very Aristotelian. But having integrity is making sure that your actions meet up and match your values. And I think someone with good self-esteem, someone who is confident in a non-arrogant sense, is somebody with very strong integrity. They know their values and they know how to meet those values.
So they're not necessarily looking for outside affirmation.
Oh, absolutely not.
Of their achievement. They're saying, I'm acting on some principle, and I'm convinced that this principle is a worthy principle, no matter the results in other people's eyes.
Right. Absolutely not. Absolutely, and they're absolutely not looking for outside affirmation. I mean, again, we think of self-esteem in the U.S. today. This is why, I can name you two experiences that were extremely valuable for me. One was that nationals debate round where I got torn apart. This is my first time doing LD at nationals. The other debater, absolutely ripped me to shreds. This was maybe my third round. I had a couple of decent rounds, right? And he just had me for dinner. I'm trying to think of all the other analogies that include me being torn to tiny pieces. That was valuable for me because it made me have to take a step back and say, okay, how do I really do this? Understanding I need to have a thick skin to develop this, right? A good debater has a very thick skin. They're not somebody who's going to kick and scream if they lose.
Right.
In how that transfers over into the real world. In my business development role, the one I'm in right now, my first business trip was about a year ago in Austin, Texas, a little bit more than a year ago. And I had maybe 8 meetings over 3 days. Very, very busy. And my last meeting was at Capital Factory, which you're probably aware of, downtown, with one of the mentors at Capital Factory. It's this incubator accelerator in Austin. Very good program. And the guy came in. I told him all about Praxis, told him, what I wanted to pitch him on, and how that related to him. And he cut me off. He told me, let me put my mentor cap on now, which I'm always skeptical of anyone who actively calls themselves a mentor. But he said that verbatim, and he tore me apart. He told me everything that was wrong about my pitch, everything why he didn't like it, and everything why he would not buy the product or indulge in what we were doing based on what I said. I left, and this was after 7 meetings that knocked out of the park.
Yeah.
I left nearly. Abby, if you want to ask Isaac what I looked like, he picked me up from Capital Factory after that. I looked like I'd seen a ghost. But that was valuable. That was an important experience for me. Losing is important.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great story, and I've experienced similar, especially when coming off of 5 successes with the same thing.
Oh, you've got this high going, right? Yeah.
Rashes you, and you're like, and some of what they say has a point.
Right.
Right.
Like I would say a lot of what that guy said, even in retrospect, yeah, I still don't agree with, but A lot of it I've actually incorporated into my pitches, and I've incorporated into how I want to develop the product too.
Well, before we close up, any parting thoughts for parents of debaters?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, kudos to you for supporting them going through debate. I know that can be a big stressor at times. Debate is a phenomenal thing for any young person to be engaged in. Homeschool parents in particular are much better about this, but in general, like I said earlier, the way that we think about careers and career advice for young people today is outdated. A lot of parents, again, from a position of love and concern in their hearts, are giving outdated career advice. If they haven't had to find a job for a couple years, especially since maybe 2005, they're speaking from a position that's very, very different than what I've experienced just through the hundreds of people I've talked to, the cumulative experience I've been able to develop. And don't be afraid if the young person in your life, your child, wants to do something unconventional. Their experience with debate has prepared them to do something unconventional. I love the fact in debate that, when I was first introduced to it, I actually have to defend a belief I don't believe in. Oh, that's weird. I love that fact because that puts you outside your comfort zone. And if you really want to stand apart from the pack nowadays as a young person, you have to step outside your comfort zone. And it might be your child stepping outside of your comfort zone as a parent. That's okay. There's, to use an example from Praxis, there's no law in the United States that requires you to go to college at 18. We tend to think that if someone doesn't go immediately into college as soon as they're done with high school, that, they're going to, be a bum forever.
Oh yeah, late bloomer, parents' basement, right there.
Right, exactly. Despite the fact that something like half of all college grads come to live with their parents after they graduate college now. No one ever talks about that. Understand that, that's okay, especially if there's some kind of structure in their lives. I would hope that would be Praxis, but it could really be any good experience like that.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Zach, thanks for taking the time today. I appreciate it.
Inspiring
to hear from someone who was one of them and is now out there making waves and splashes. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, Abby.